Today, we're going to take our 4-inch Eliminator Rocket design and shrink it down to a 3-inch design, creating a more aerodynamic, lighter weight rocket that will fly faster and higher. This is going to be fun. Now, we've built several 3-inch rockets, but the mini Eliminator that we're going to be building today has a few features that are different than our previous designs. The most significant difference is the motor. Typically, our 3-inch rockets are designed to use our Dart Monkey motor. It's our smallest homemade motor. But today's rocket is going to be designed to hold our Super Monkey motor. Now, the Super Monkey motor is the motor that we use to launch the regular 4-inch Eliminator rocket. So putting this in a more aerodynamic, lighter weight rocket is going to mean a significant increase for launch speed and altitude. The other major difference between today's build and our previous 3-inch rockets is the fin material. This is our first rocket that will use 1/8-inch MDF for the fins. Now, I've wanted to use 1/8-inch MDF for fin material for a long time, but unfortunately, this is just something that's not available in any of our local stores. So I had to purchase this online and have it custom cut to 8-inch by 8-inch pieces to fit on our CNC cutting machine. Now, I'm not sure if I'll be able to use 1/8-inch MDF for the fins on the full-size 4-inch Eliminator rocket. Those fins are a lot larger, and I'm not sure if this material will be able to handle that stress. That's a project for another day. But for this smaller rocket, I think this is going to work out great. It's super lightweight, and that thin 1/8-inch profile is going to cut through the air with less resistance than any of the other fin materials we're currently using. Everything I need to build this rocket is already cut out, so let's take a look at the parts. So starting out with the body tubes, we've got the upper body tube. It's just 3-inch cardboard shipping tube. And then we've got the lower body tube. This is where the fins will be installed. And then we've got a coupling that will be installed in that to join those two parts together. And we've got 4 1/8-inch MDF fins. Then some internal parts. We have a bulkhead. This is the motor bulkhead that the motor will be pushing against. We have a motor centering ring. We have 2 fin installation rings. The lower one of these is also the motor centering ring. And then we've got a parachute bulkhead. Now, all these parts here are made from the 1/8-inch MDF, except for the parachute bulkhead. I chose to use 1/4-inch MDF for this. There's a lot of stress on this part when the parachute deploys, so kind of wanted something a little bit stronger. And then I've got a 1-inch ring that will be installed on top of that just to reinforce it so that it doesn't get pulled out of place when the parachute deploys. And I've got 2 rail buttons. These just allow the rocket to slide onto the launch rail. And to assist in installing the fins and getting them properly aligned, I made a fin alignment tool. And all the parts are going to be glued in place using Loctite PL construction adhesive. Now, today's video is not going to be a build tutorial. If you're interested in knowing how we build the Eliminator rocket, we have a complete step-by-step tutorial video that shows how to build the original 4-inch Eliminator design. It includes downloadable templates for the fins, as well as some of the internal parts. There's also downloadable files for 3D printing the nose cone and the electronics bay. I'll put a link to that video down in the description. Let's get started building the mini Eliminator rocket. I need to cut slots in the lower body tube where the fins will be installed. I start out by making a paper template and marking it with the locations for the 4 fins. Now I can mark the fin locations on the tube. I'll extend those lines up the length of the tube and then mark the points where the slots will begin and end. The slots are cut with a sideways cutting bit in the drill press. This cutting process leaves a bit of a mess inside the tube that needs to be sanded away. The fins snap into place and fit great. Now we're ready to install the fins. Because of the way the fins are designed with this little hook piece on the top, they stay in place all by themselves. And I'm going to install the lower binding ring first. So we'll flip this over and I'll apply adhesive to the area where the ring is going to be installed. And then I'll install the ring. Now I've got it generally positioned in the right place, The fin alignment tool will position that in the proper location. So we'll go ahead and insert this into the alignment tool. And then I'll put a rubber band around the whole thing. That will just hold the fins tight against the body tube. And then we're ready to install the upper binding ring. Now this one's a little tricky because it gets glued in about 6 inches down, and because the body tube is so small, it's difficult to get your hand down there. That's one of the nice things about building the larger 4-inch rockets. There's just a lot more space than on these smaller ones. So I'm going to use a stick to apply the adhesive down inside the tube. And then I'll install the upper ring. Let that sit for a few hours and then we can move on to the next step. Fins are glued in place. Now it's time for the upper motor centering ring. And then the motor bulkhead. Followed by the coupling. Next are the 2 rail buttons. Now it's very important that I install the upper rail button before attaching the body tube to the rocket, because once the body tube is installed, I won't be able to reach down inside the rocket to hold the nut for the rail button. Before I attach the upper body tube to the rocket, I'm going to drill the vent holes in this. Now we're ready to glue the upper body tube onto the lower portion of the rocket. Now at the same time, we'll be gluing in the parachute bulkhead that sits right there, and the 1-inch retaining ring that goes on top of the bulkhead like that. Now I did attach a length of paracord to the parachute bulkhead, because it occurred to me that with this small diameter of the body tube, I'm not going to be able to reach down there to attach and detach the paracord from the bulkhead like we can on the larger 4-inch rockets. So this needs a permanently installed parachute recovery cord. So I'll go ahead and get these parts glued together. I have a technique that helps keep these 2 parts aligned while the adhesive is dried. I just take a short piece of the body tube and cut a slice down one side of it. If we slide that down over the 2 parts, and I'm just going to put a whole bunch of rubber bands around that to secure it snugly in place. And then we'll let it sit for several hours for that adhesive to harden. All right, that adhesive is dry. I 3D printed the nose cone last night. That is so cute. So it's time for paint. And there it is, the 3-inch mini Eliminator rocket. Now when I started this project, the goal was to make a scaled down 3-inch diameter version of the 4-inch Eliminator rocket, and it came out fantastic. I can't wait to fly this, but it's got me thinking, 4-inch Eliminator rocket, 3-inch mini Eliminator, should I do it? Should I make the 2-inch micro Eliminator rocket? Well, looking at how good this came out, I kind of feel like I really have to at this point. But there's some design changes that need to be made for a 2-inch rocket just because of the small diameter. So let's take a look at the changes we need to make in order to make the 2-inch micro Eliminator rocket. So the first thing we need to work on is fin installation. So normally when we install fins on a 3-inch or 4-inch rocket, we use a technique called through fin. That means there's a tab on the fin and a slot in the body tube, and the fin goes through the slot into the body tube, and then some method is used to secure the fin inside of the rocket. Well, we can't do that on this particular rocket because with the 2-inch body tube, our motor fits almost perfectly inside that body tube, so there's no room on the inside for those fin tabs. Another technique that's commonly used for attaching fins is called surface mount, and that's where the fin is just simply glued to the surface of the body tube. That's pretty common on smaller rockets like Estes model rockets. Unfortunately, that technique really isn't very strong. You're simply gluing to paper, and if that tears while the rocket's in flight, well, there goes your fin. So we can't do through fins, and I don't want to do surface mount fins, so what are we going to do? Well, I'm going to use kind of a hybrid between those two ideas. Let me show you what we're going to do. I've designed the fins with this really tiny tab. The tabs fit into the slots on the body tube, but they're so small that they don't stick into the tube. I've made another fin alignment tool for this rocket. I'll put a small amount of adhesive on each fin just above and below the fin tabs. And then install all the fins and let that adhesive harden. Now that the adhesive has had plenty of time to harden, we can remove that from the alignment tool and finish gluing the fins in place. I'm going to use the Loctite PL construction adhesive, and I'm going to apply a thin layer on the inside just to bond that tiny fin tab to the inside of the tube. And then I'll come to the outside and install thin layers of adhesive in the transition area between the fin and the cardboard tube. Now, this particular construction adhesive expands a little bit when it dries, so that could cause some issues. First problem it might cause is that if it expands too much on the inside, we won't be able to fit the motor into the cardboard tube anymore. If that happens, I can just come back with a file and file down the high spots until the motor fits properly. And then on the outside here in the fillet area, what we're going to have is bumpy, uneven fillets because of the way the adhesive dries. So that's really just a cosmetic issue, but I like to have smooth fillets. So I'll come back later and put a couple layers of liquid nails construction adhesive over those fillets just to smooth out those areas. Well, that came out absolutely fantastic. Not really through fins, but not really surface mount fins. They're nice and strong, and I think for this size rocket, that's going to work out just fine. I did have to do a little filing work on the inside in order to get the motor to fit, but now the motor fits absolutely perfect in there, so that's great. Next, we've got the motor bulkhead that the motor pushes against, and the tube coupler that will get installed like that. So I'll go ahead and get those glued in place. Once that adhesive dried, I went ahead and installed the lower rail button. And normally I would install the lower rail button much closer to the bottom of the rocket, but because the motor takes up all the space there, this was as far down as we could install it. And then I took the upper body tube out to the shop and drilled the vent holes and installed the upper rail button. Now we just need to glue these two together, but at the same time, we're going to be gluing in the parachute bulkhead with its parachute attachment cord. That goes right on top of the coupler there. And then we have a reinforcing ring that gets glued in on top of that. So all this needs to get glued in all at once. And that brings us to the next issue we need to work out for this rocket, the nose cone. You see, I have no 3D print files for a 2-inch diameter nose cone because ever since we started 3D printing nose cones, we've only built 3-inch and 4-inch rockets. So it's off to Tinkercad to design a nose cone. I designed the nose cone and the mounting base for the flight computer and 3D printed the parts. The mounting base came out perfect on the first print. I've got an empty ejection charge installed here. The flight computer just slides into a little slot like that, and the battery slides into a little slot right there. And that is absolutely perfect. Now the nose cone, however, took a couple of tries, but eventually I ended up with one that fits absolutely perfect. The last thing I need to build for this rocket is a parachute. Now for our 3-inch and 4-inch rockets, I've got several parachutes to choose from, but I don't have any parachutes for a small rocket like this. So I'm going to build a really simple parachute out of one of these plastic table covers. You can get these at dollar stores or party supply stores. It's a really thin plastic material. I think it'll work just fine for this size rocket. I decided to make a 24-inch round parachute with 6 shroud lines. I was originally planning on making a larger parachute for this rocket, but the parachute bay is only 12 inches deep, and I want to make sure that the parachute fits nice and loose so it comes out very easy. So that's why I decided on a smaller 24-inch parachute. The shroud lines I'm going to be using are these really tiny nylon cords. These are the cords that come out of the center of paracord. A lot of times when I use paracord, I take out the center cords just to make it lighter and a little more flexible. Well, I kept a bunch of those, and that's going to work perfectly for this parachute. They're really super small, but they're really strong. I marked the 24-inch diameter circle and cut out the shape. All right, so we have a problem. I knew that this table covering material was thin and weak, but I thought it was going to be strong enough for this project. So I tied a shroud line onto a sample piece, and it's clearly way too weak. This is just not going to work. So I have 2 other options. First is just to use the ripstop nylon fabric that we typically use to make our larger parachutes. I do have a scrap piece of this, would be perfect for this parachute. The other option is to go back to a technique that I used years ago, and that's to use a lightweight plastic shower curtain liner to make the parachute. Now, both of these materials would work fine for this project. I'm just trying to decide which one would fold up smallest to fit best into this small rocket. I think just judging from the feel of the material, it's going to come out very similar. So I'm going to go ahead and use the ripstop nylon fabric because it's just a stronger material. So let's make the parachute out of that. All right, so here's a scrap piece of the ripstop nylon. Let's check it out. Yeah, that's significantly stronger. I mean, I could probably pull it out. Ow. No, that's really strong. So this is a good choice. So I'll go ahead and tie the shroud lines on. And there's the finished parachute. A paint job to match the other rockets. And there it is, the Micro Eliminator Rocket. Now I know what you're thinking. Am I going to build the tiny 1-inch Eliminator rocket? No, I'm not going to build that today. I am planning on doing that in the future, but just not for this video. I've already built 1 extra rocket for this video than I was planning on doing, so we'll stop right there with the builds. Now, I have made the 2 motors we're going to launch with these rockets, so let's head out to the launch site. All right, it's a great day for a launch. Hey, before we get to the rockets, make sure you hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And be sure to check out the full line of rotary rocketry merchandise. There's a link to our shop down in the description. All right, so here's our 3 rockets for today. Now, we're not going to be launching the 4-inch Eliminator rocket today. We've already launched that several times and we know how it performs. With our Super Monkey motor, this has a launch weight of 1,912 grams, and on our last launch it got to 1,040 feet or 317 meters. So the real goal for today's video was to see how that same motor would perform in a significantly smaller rocket, and that is the 3-inch Mini Eliminator. This has a much smaller profile, has the smaller fins, and it weighs 40% less launch weight than the 4-inch rocket. So we've got a launch weight of 1,157 grams for this rocket. So this should be a really great launch, a lot faster, and I'm expecting a lot more altitude. When we're done with the launch for that, we'll talk a little bit more about the motor for the 2-inch Micro Eliminator. So let's get set up for the 3-inch Mini Eliminator. Beautiful launch, beautiful landing. Let's find out how high it went. All right, that was a fantastic launch. Amazing altitude, more than I expected. So we reached 2,064 feet or 629 meters. Pretty much double what we would normally see for that motor in the 4-inch Eliminator. That was amazing. Well, let's go talk about the micro Eliminator rocket and the motor we're going to launch in that. And our final rocket for today is our 2-inch micro Eliminator. Now, I didn't use the Super Monkey motor in this because I felt it was just way too much power for this rocket. So we'll be launching it with our smaller Dart Monkey motor. Let's get going. Wow. All right, so here it is. We seem to have lost the chute. So the rocket came down without a parachute. Unfortunately, that means we did break a fin. We're still looking for the parachute. All right, so we discovered what happened, and I feel really bad because it was entirely my fault. I forgot to connect the recovery cord from the rocket to the central mounting point under the nose cone. So the nose cone and the parachute came down, and the rocket came down separately without a parachute, and it's pretty well destroyed at that point. That's a rebuild. Might rebuild one of those. It was kind of cute. Now, this had a launch weight of 592 grams, but again, it used that smaller motor. We did get a launch altitude of 1,352 feet. So really good launch, just very poor recovery. So, final thoughts. Well, the new 1/8-inch thick fin material held up fantastic. In fact, one of the fins on this rocket hit the ground really hard when it landed, and it didn't break, so I'm really happy with that. I think if I launch the 3-inch rocket again, I'm going to use a slightly larger parachute to slow that descent rate down a little bit. And that brings us to the 2-inch rocket. That was really just a stupid mistake. I simply forgot to connect the cord from the rocket to the parachute. This fin is completely destroyed, and the adhesive is cracked on the next fin over. To be honest, it would simply be easier to build an entirely new rocket rather than try to fix this level of damage. But overall, the project was a success because the goal was to see how the Super Monkey motor would perform in this lighter weight, smaller 3-inch rocket. And the launch was spectacular. And that 2,000-foot altitude was way higher than I expected. So I'm really happy with that. I am working on the design of the tiny 1-inch diameter Eliminator rocket, so be looking for that in a future video. Hit that like button, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, we'll see you next time. Rapturing journey into space. Rapturing